Hey everyone. Hey, I wanted to talk today a little bit about some games that I've been playing for the past year or so, I think. They pertain to the topic. It's like a counterinsurgency or asymmetric warfare, and really fascinating games. You can kind of see the wide-angle shot that I have here on my table. Every single one of the games that I have here have, as a common element, the same designer, whose name is Brian Train. And I guess he's really produced quite a number of these types of games of asymmetric warfare or counterinsurgency. I should probably qualify that statement and just say that the one that he did not design is Andean Abyss, which is in the green box on the right. But he has, by way of influence, found his design elements that he created in earlier games have made their way into the coin series. So what I wanted to do with this video is just talk a little bit about these sorts of games, talk a little bit about some common elements that they have, and try to break down of all the titles that he's produced, the subset that I have for you today, where you can find them, and who makes them, what common system they have, things of that nature. So let me just begin with what I have on the table. This actually is a game. It's a desktop publishing game by Brian. It's called Andartes, the Greek Civil War, 1947 through 1949. You can see the cover of it over here. It's a game that I actually had, as desktop publishing implies, had to put together myself in order to be able to play. So what ends up happening is that you can buy directly from him some sheets where he's printed the counters, and then you peel them off and actually apply them onto either physical counters onto a piece of cardboard and then cut them out. And that's what I've done to make this game. But more specifically, what I wanted to bring your attention to on this game is the map element. And as you can see here, it's an area control game. And within each area, it actually has a large box that's superimposed over the area. The box is broken down into 4 smaller boxes, and there are some letters that are superimposed on the map. The letters are signifying in order underground, operations, patrol, and OC for operations completed. And within a game turn, you have a series of missions that you can perform, and these 4 boxes actually relate to the missions and help you to organize exactly what's taking place in that specific area. But that idea of having the 4 boxes in each area has kind of given rise, particularly on Board Game Geek, where the conversation occurred, that the common design element in many of these games are the 4 boxes, and thus they're called the 4-box games. So there are a number of them. As I said, I've really kind of gone deep off the deep end into these counterinsurgency games. But what I've done actually here on this piece of paper is to write down a number of games that were produced by Brian. And let me just run through them real quick, because I think you'll find some of the topic matter to be really esoteric, but nonetheless really interesting. So Tupamaro, I think, is the first game. And here I'm actually going by the information that he's written on his website about what it's about and when it was produced. So I think in the mid-90s he produced this game, although it was actually reprinted by another publisher called One Small Step very recently. But this has to do with an uprising that occurred in the city of Montevideo in Uruguay in South America. Also in South America, he produced a game in '96 called Shining Path. Shining Path has to do with the Sendero Luminoso in the country of Peru. Algeria is the next title that I have written down. I think it was originally created in the year 2000, and this has to do with the uprising that took place after World War II in the country of Algeria, where the insurgents tried to free themselves from colonial rule from France. Or I guess technically it wouldn't be colonial rule because Algeria was officially a department of France, but you see where I'm going. The next one, Andartes, is the one that I have on the table. It concerns the Greek Civil War, 47 through 49, so right after World War II. What we're looking at here is a communist insurgency in Greece. Aoka is another one. I actually have this title over here. I'll show you the cover of it. There it is there. Another desktop publishing title. And as the title indicates, it's the Cyprus Emergency 1955 through 1959. So on the island of Cyprus in the Mediterranean Sea. Kandahar is another one. This has to do with the ISAF in Afghanistan and the insurgency that's taking place there with the Taliban. All the titles that I've mentioned up till now actually are what are known as these 4-box games. So I've made a little column here that shows with the 4 boxes that they all use the basic system of the 4 boxes to control the missions that are available in a turn. And so for that reason, they give kind of a common denominator to all these titles in terms of the game system. There are a few titles that he did, and by the way, this list here is not meant to be totally synoptic of all the games that he's done, but it's basically the games that I either own or have tried to play in some form or fashion. So there are 2, called one Green Beret 1996 and then Ben Min 69, which was produced in 2014, which are not actually 4-box games. They do have area control, and they do have the topic of insurgency as their topical matter, but they're not necessarily using the same system as the titles that have preceded them. And then finally there's one on the Hungarian uprising called Operation Whirlwind that he originally did in 2002. So this column here is what I want to talk about next. It says OSS Folio. So there's a game publisher called One Small Step, and they've produced a really attractive and inexpensive series of titles that they call their Folio series. So I've put a check mark next to the title for all the ones where the title actually does exist in the OSS Folio series. What's interesting about these games also is that it seems like Brian has produced a desktop publishing version of the game, but then when someone like One Small Step decides to pick up the title from them, he allows them to be republished in the Folio series. So Kandahar is a good example here, Southern Afghanistan, 2008, 2010. This is interesting because, you know, this Kandahar, as well as 2 other titles, Ben Din and Green Beret, and then finally Algeria over here, they all have similar topical matter to other counterinsurgency games. And by other counterinsurgency games, what I mean quite specifically is the Coin series from GMT. So I know if you're watching this video, you're, doubtless aware that the Coin series exists. And while the mechanics are not the same, the subject matter in many cases is. So Algeria, the game that I showed just a moment ago, received Coin treatment, so to speak, from GMT in the game Colonial Twilight, which was done by Brian. Kandahar has similar subject matter to A Distant Plain that Brian had a hand in making. And then another game, Fire in the Lake, has to do with Vietnam. And so even though there's no relation either to the game or the game designer between Green Beret and Ben Min 69 and Fire in the Lake, nonetheless, they are the same in the sense that they have the same primary combatants, and they both deal with counterinsurgency within Vietnam. This thing that I have out here on the side, Andean Abyss, with an asterisk on it, that's kind of an interesting matter. So it seems that if you read kind of deeply on Board Game Geek, follow a lot of the threads as related to these games, that when the Coin series was first created by Volko Rumka, one element that he took into or incorporated into his design was that he actually had seen or had played a version of Algeria, not the One Small Step version, but a desktop publishing version, I think. He actually had played that, and he liked the mechanics in the game, including the missions. So actually, if you go through and you read some of the missions, they read quite similar to what you'll find in the Coin series, and I'll talk about those in just a minute. So yeah, so that's the games that I've been playing. It's quite a few, and what I want to do now, I think, is just kind of transition and talk quite specifically about some of the design elements that are common to the 4-box games. So let me actually switch my props, and I'll bring over another piece of paper. So what you'll find, actually, when you play one of these games is that there are different unit types. So on the one hand, you might have CBT, which stands for combatant. There's also CDR, which stands for cadre, although I used to be a Lisp programmer, so I actually think about cutter and not cadre. But anyway, combatant, cadre. There's also AUX for auxiliary units. And the first two, combatant units and cadre units, are mobile, meaning they can actually move from space to space depending upon where you want them to be deployed. Auxiliary units are more, I think in the designer notes, he actually says they're more like the human terrain. So basically, if it's on the insurgent side, a series of informers or money or things that would be bound up in the human infrastructure for being able to produce an insurgency. If the unit actually is a combatant unit and it's mobile, and I'm not sure if my camera will zoom in here, I'll try to give it a moment to do so, you'll see that they're represented by the NATO counter. And if it's represented by an icon, like this one, I'll show you here, this actually is an auxiliary unit, which is static, meaning that it has to stay in that particular area. So here you actually have a police unit, and it's actually deployed on the mission called patrol. So you have mobile units and static units. You might also have non-state actors. So in Kandahar, as an example, you might have non-state militias or criminal gangs who also can be used and deployed on the map. Aoka has a similar concept where it has a series of units that are called Vulcan units. So what those represent, if memory serves, are units that might naturally arise in a counterinsurgency, a predisposition towards counterinsurgency, but they're not actually a state actor. So you might have, if you ever played Andean Abyss, you might have the right-wing paramilitaries would be an example of that, and would be somewhat analogous to the Vulcan units in Aoka. So as I mentioned before, the four boxes that exist on the map are underground, operations, patrol, and operations completed. And as you run through your missions, you actually move some of the markers from, say, for example, underground. If you have a cadre unit which exists in one area, and the cadre unit might perform a specific mission, whenever the cadre unit performs the mission, it would move from the underground box into the operations completed. The map areas are also, you can see they're sort of color coded, and you can have, in this game in particular, 3 different types of map areas. So you have urban map areas, rural map areas, and remote areas. What I've noticed also in some of these games, actually most of them, is that there's also kind of an extra area that's put into place. And this, I don't know, it kind of serves almost like a Deus Ex Machina in a novel where, you have the main area where, the activity has taken place, and then off to the side, you can have germinating some type of, let's say, insurgent forces who get built up and then actually move on to the map area at a later turn. So in Kandahar, a good example of the extra area would be Pakistan. In Aoka, it's Greece. Here in Andartes, you can actually see them. There are areas off to the side, so Albania, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria. So I'll just take a moment and just explain why those extra areas exist in this game. Whenever the communist insurgency was taking place in Greece during 1947 and 1949, you probably remember from history that there were concurrent communist activities that were taking place in Europe. So in Yugoslavia, Tito was on the rise, and in Bulgaria there was also a communist presence having to do from the remainders of the Soviet divisions that still existed in Bulgaria. Bulgaria ended up becoming a member of the Warsaw Pact. So there are some special rules within the game that have to do with or pertain to the extra areas that you find off the side of the map. I have a note here that in Algeria, as well as Colonial Twilight, a similar extra area exists in Morocco, Tunisia, and France. So what are the missions that you can do? What are the missions that take place within this game? Actually, this is like the primary mechanic of the game. So there's actually a segment that takes place within the player turn where you run a series of missions. One interesting thing is that the designer, Brian, he seems to have divided the missions out between either kinetic missions, which I think is the kind of a contemporary term for anything that has to do with violence or force, and then there's also non-kinetic. So within Kandahar, as an example, you would have expropriation or attack as an example of a kinetic mission. And in Kandahar, as an example of a non-kinetic mission, you might have things like civic affairs, where somebody on the, for lack of a better term, the Allied side tries to build up, the civic infrastructure in the country. You might have neutralization or surveillance. Now, Andartes also has a series of missions as well, although as far as I can tell, Brian didn't use the kinetic, non-kinetic distinction within Andartes, but you can kind of map them still nonetheless. So examples of missions that you would have are harass, strike, raid, combat, flush, and suppression. So you can probably figure out what those map to. So like Greek forces that are here in blue have a NATO symbol and are mobile, so basically they are combatants. They would probably have the ability to do combat missions or raids or something along those lines. Non-kinetic missions in Andartes would be, for example, propaganda, movement, so moving from one area to the other, patrol, which is what the police do, intelligence, so someone on the Allied side picking up intelligence about cadres and fronts on the insurgent side, civic affairs, and then the government player actually has the ability to root out the population, or should I say uproot them and move them from one place to another. So that's actually done with something that's called population resettlement. So what's interesting about these games also, and you can kind of see it over here on the left-hand side, I have something which is called the all-purpose track. I'm not sure if I have an example to bring into closer view. It doesn't look like I do. Maybe I do in Aoka. No. But anyway, the point is that like the coin games, you have the coin games that have them running around the edge of the board. You have a tracker, if you will, which actually tracks the so-called victory points for each side. On the government side, in Andartes, you have the government's political support level, so basically the level at which the civilian population supports the government. And then you also have a notion called government AP, or administration points. So every time you have a turn, you have to collect your administration points together to be able to, in effect, fund the missions that you want to perform during a player turn. Likewise, the DSE, who are the insurgents in Andartes, they also have their administration points, and they also have their PSL as well. And what's really interesting about these games, especially the desktop publishing version and the Folio versions, not the coin versions, is that you can track the political support level, but there's no real level at which one side or the other is determined a winner. You can set certain objectives by agreeing amongst the players before the game as to what kind of the victory conditions or victory points would be. But these games really play out kind of like Counterinsurgencies did, where there's no real defined victory in a sense. But as you play the game, you can kind of determine whenever one side or the other is kind of in a victory position, is kind of won the conflict between government and the insurgents. All right, so let me just talk a little bit about some inspiration for these games. If there was actually a couple of threads on Board Game Geek. Actually, no, it was one thread on Board Game Geek where I saw that somebody had written that if you really wanted to draw inspiration for playing the game Andartes, there was a good book called The Fratricides by Kazantzakis. He's the person that wrote Zorba the Greek and also wrote The Last Temptation of Christ. And this book actually is a really great book about kind of the motivations behind the insurgents and why it is that the actual civil war within Greece took place. I think in an interview with the Player's Aid, the designer mentioned that there was a really good contemporary book on counterinsurgencies, and the name of that book is The Logic of Violence in Civil War. I thought that I had it printed out, but I guess I don't. So if you want to take kind of a theoretical understanding of why it is that insurgencies and civil wars take place and gain an understanding of the motivations for the combatants, that's a really excellent book on that topic. And then finally, I would make mention also of, if you happen to play the game Shining Path on the Sendero Luminoso, there is a novel by Mario Vargas Llosa called The Real Life of Alejandro Maita, which I actually found to be a very good background on the insurgency that took place that's represented in the game Shining Path. So with that, I think we're going to end this video. What I'd like to do next is actually take a deep dive into one of these games. So I'll probably go with a desktop publishing version first and just show the mechanics of the game and the way that it plays out. And then I'll take another video and go through one of the games that was a desktop publishing game from Brian Train that was eventually included in the Folio series from One Small Step. Try to play through and show some of the differences. The actual physical components of the game that come in the One Small Step version, as you can imagine, are a lot nicer than they are in the desktop publishing version. But the actual rules for the game are not too dissimilar. I mean, the actual 4-box mechanic, as well as the idea of missions, plays out through all of the games. And what I hope to do in the next couple of videos is just to show you how to play one of these in the desktop publishing version, and then move on and show the next version, which appeared in the Folio series from One Small Step. So with that, I'll let you go, and hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope that you'll return and join me on the next one.